This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. Dmitri Shostakovich spent his entire life falling in and out of favor with the Soviet music authorities. He became an international sensation in 1925 with his first symphony. He was just 19, and it was his graduation exercise for the conservatory. His first two operas were smashing successes: his sarcastic comedy The Nose and his raw drama Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk. Even the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin wanted to know what all the fuss was about, but when he went to see Lady Macbeth, he was scandalized. The newspaper Pravda published an editorial entitled "Chaos Instead of Music," attacking the composer and his opera for formalism, lack of melody, immorality in the choice of story and the manner of telling it, and all around for exemplifying leftist muddle instead of natural human music, end quote. Everything changed for Shostakovich, and for the first time, but not the last, he lived in fear of his career and his life. Shostakovich was partially rehabilitated in 1937 with his Fifth Symphony, which Pravda referred to as a Soviet artist's creative response to just criticism. But his position was never completely secure again. Soviet arts policy was committed to the idea that to be worth anything, a work had to make a political or ideological statement. Of course, a correct one. And whether intentional or not, Shostakovich seemed to alternate between populist entertainments like his movie scores, grand statements of party glory, and works that no one could quite figure out. By the end of World War II in 1945, the country was ready for his Ninth Symphony, and they expected a great victory symphony like Beethoven's Ninth. What they got was something very different. Shostakovich had actually started a big celebratory symphony the year before, as the tide of war was turning. He had played a first movement for colleagues and friends and even announced what he was doing and was quoted in the press, saying, "On the threshold of approaching victory, we must honor with reverence the memory of the brave soldiers who have died and glorify the heroes of our army for all eternity," end quote. But for some reason, over the next year, he changed his mind completely. His new symphony was less than half the length of either of his previous two, with none of their drama or heroism. It was, essentially, a comedy. The public enjoyed it, but the Soviet authorities were enraged, and a few short years later, Shostakovich and even the writers who had praised the symphony were in the party's crosshairs once again. So what was it that got the Soviets so upset? Quite simply, it wasn't what they thought it should be, Beethoven at his grandest. Instead, what they got was Beethoven's teacher at his wittiest. Just as Prokofiev had 40 years earlier with his First Symphony, Shostakovich channels the spirit of Haydn. The first movement sets the tone, crisp, light, and fast-moving. After the strings start things off, the next theme is a twitchy little melody for the piccolo, but introduced by the trombone at its most raucous. That trombone keeps insisting on making itself heard even after the piccolo is done. Shostakovich repeats the exposition, just as Haydn and Mozart would have done, then heads into the development, which concentrates on the opening music. In the recapitulation, the concertmaster takes over the piccolo tune, and the tiny coda is unceremoniously squashed. The second movement begins with a long melody for the solo clarinet, with just the barest hint of accompaniment by pizzicato cellos and basses. The melody spools out without repeating itself or doubling back, describing a beautifully shaped arch. A second clarinet joins the first, the strings drop out and the winds have a beautiful moment to themselves. The strings return with their mutes on in an even more melancholy waltz. The flute brings back the clarinet's opening monologue. And then passes it to the piccolo to close out this sad song. The second movement is the symphony's longest, and the third is its shortest. This one is comedy, but with teeth. There's a trumpet melody that brings to mind the Capriccio Espagnol by Rimsky-Korsakov, who was the teacher of Shostakovich's teacher. Things start to slow down. And the movement is suddenly interrupted by a stern proclamation issued by trombones and tuba, dramatically shifting the mood. The brasses give way to another soliloquy for a woodwind instrument. But this time it's the bassoon playing its own operatic aria. This is the one moment in which Shostakovich does seem to be remembering the war dead, but is it because he is being ordered to? The brass repeat their challenge, and the bassoon responds with something even more intensely expressive. holding the last note for a long time, and then suddenly, we are in the finale. The bassoon is still the protagonist, but this is now the other, comic side of the instrument. The transition from pathos to fun and games at the circus is a bit of a shock. But pretty soon the music leaves it all behind, as Shostakovich uses almost everything in his musical jokebook, from the tunes themselves to the daringly simple rhythms and the pointed orchestration. The tempo and energy increase bit by bit. Leading to a quick and joyous finale. Shostakovich is a critic's and historian's dream, a composer who added essential works to the repertory, a man who functioned in a society tyrannically demanding of its artists, but who could not commit himself either to heroism or to moral and intellectual slavery, and whose actions, statements, and music cover the gamut from noble to base. It's hard to think of another composer whose work is so intensely affected by life, his own, but also that of the world in which and for which he wrote. Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony embodies all of these contradictions, and we may never know why he wrote it the way he did. But in the end, it may simply be that he wanted to turn the human comedy into a musical one. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.